This article 1v1, Double Cleanliness+Double Rebirth+Ultimate Pet+Vest+Double Strength+Two way journey. In her past life, she used all her strength, her crimson eyes, and with blood and bones all over her body as a bond, she placed an eternal curse and slept with him in the underground cave where ghosts marched. After being reborn and returning, she practiced ghost magic and became the only infinite ghost master in the land of the void to master and control 10,000 poisons. People are afraid of her cruel and bloodthirsty nature, but little do they know that she was once gentle and innocent. Rumor has it that the 9th prince of Yinfu kingdom is cold and heartless, and was born without a heart. She mocked the world for being too foolish and foolish, blind in heart and eyes. In this world, she is the only one who knows. He has a heart that can warm the world. However, this heart was stored with her 800 years ago. Meeting again, she only seeks her heart, seeking his heart. May your heart be like mine, your heart. I have always taken good care of it, waiting for the next life to meet. I will return your heart, and you will keep me forever. She trembled softly and finally said the last words she could not say to him 800 years ago. He gave a wild and wicked smile, tightly embracing her in his arms. Tang, I have been waiting for you for a long time, he said, the cold-hearted and ruthless female protagonist who kills gods versus the noble and domineering male protagonist who has a jade bone medicine heart. I don't know where the hero buried his bones, where the light rain and crabapple flowers fell. This article is not a rebirth revenge article, but a text that compensates for regrets and seeks the truth. There will be a major reversal, and those who fall into the pit should be mentally prepared. Original title. The fierce consort of the demon lord is reborn. Keywords of the novel. Demon concubine and ghost vine in hand, not a fierce beast, she does not keep no pop-ups. Demon concubine and ghost vine in hand, not a fierce beast, she does not keep TXT complete collection download. Demon concubine and ghost vine in hand, not a fierce beast, she does not keep latest chapters read. Chapter 1. Master, Conquering Ghosts. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Master, Conquering Ghosts. The Ghost City of the Underworld. Shen Tang fell into a blood-stained red dress, and his 3,000 ink-colored hair was casually tied up with a red headband. That cold and seductive face bloomed freely under the black and red light of the ring, with long hair fluttering like a fallen demon reborn from the flames. Her cold peach blossom eyes burst out with a bloodthirsty chill, and a wicked and arrogant harshness rolled out from the corner of her mouth. Let Nangong Zhu get out of here. The leader of the ghost generals, Nialan, personally led a group of ghost soldiers to rush over, and she climbed onto the high walls of the city tower. A pair of angry eyes stared fixedly at the cold and ruthless red figure beneath the ghost city. Seeing Shen Tangluo, Nialan's nails fiercely dug into the cold wall and gave orders to the ghost soldiers under the city gate, seal the entrance. The gloomy eyes of Nialan reflected the completely indifferent figure of Shen Tangluo. As soon as she thought that her existence had destroyed the noble man, she couldn't help but rage and say, you don't deserve to see the Lord. Shen Tang lowered his eyes and lifted his tail, making a soft hiss. His fingers lifted slightly, followed by a series of mournful screams lingering at the entrance of the ghost city. She curled her lips and said, not worthy. Doesn't it match? She lowered her eyes and smiled lightly twice. Nialan, I haven't seen you for 100 years. Why, are you blind or not? I've forgotten who I am. She is the female demon head who emerged from the blood prison, a merciless killing god that makes ghosts tremble with fear. As she spoke, a black and red ghost vine wriggled out of her palm and wrapped around the neck of the ghost soldier, blocking her path at a ghostly speed. The ghost soldier struggled twice with the entanglement around his neck before he could let out a painful howl. In an instant, my body turned into ashes and disappeared from everyone's sight. Next, 2 dozens of ghost soldiers in a row turned into black mist as the strangulation vine climbed and dispersed. Someone, Nialan, was very anxious and immediately waved his hand, ordering the group of ghost soldiers under the ghost city, let's go together. We must stop her. If you want to stop me, you will be practicing for tens of thousands of years, all of you are delusional. Shen Tang's eyes fell cold, and his mouth curved with evil intent, sneering incessantly. Master, conquer ghosts. As soon as the words fell, the black and red lights crisscrossed and scattered at the entrance of the ghost city, and the martial arts with wind and mist invaded the ghost soldiers in the sky with a thunderous momentum. Shen Tang fell and floated in mid-air, with a black and red halo lingering under his feet. He wore a red robe that was enchanting and wild, making hunting sounds in the strong wind. The cold and stunning face was covered with layers of frost, and a pair of peach blossom eyes lurked with bloodthirsty coldness that destroyed the heavens and earth. Suddenly, the leading ghost soldier was shocked and stared incredulously at the woman in the void, surrounded by black and red light. This is a ghost magic technique, the soul-seizing lock. Be careful, everyone. Go back, go back. Upon hearing the sound, the ghost soldiers all retreated to the city gate. However, by the time they realized it, it was already too late. The aura of slaughter quietly spreads in the waterfall. Shen Tang's mouth curled up recklessly, and the ghostly man Sha Hua technique in his palm ran freely, howling everywhere he passed. Finally, the ghost city of the underworld was completely destroyed, and millions of ghost soldiers never survived. At this moment, the left lord of the ghost city, Nialan, was locked in his throat by Shen Tangluo using the strangulation vine in his palm, struggling with difficulty, and his eyes were filled with turbulent waves. Shen Tang said coldly, "Tell me, where is the southern palace candle?" Nialan's cheeks flushed with pain, and she struggled to breathe. "No. I don't know." Shen Tangluo let out a soft sneer, her eyebrows and eyes cold, and without hesitation, she wanted to end her life. Without saying it, there is no need to keep her. Nialan looked up, with a deep expression of pain. She exerted all her strength to grab Shen Tangluo's sleeve and opened her mouth. She doesn't want to die. Shen Tangluo put away his martial arts skills and coldly waited for Nialan to speak. A deep mockery appeared in his eyes, but no waves were visible. Cough. Cough. Nialan took a deep breath and coughed fiercely, causing her face to turn red. A hint of impatience appeared in Shen Tangluo's eyes, and Nialan saw that she had lost patience. He hoarsely said, "Shen Tangluo, I won't see you. Otherwise, if you had caused such a commotion, he would have appeared long ago." Shen Tang's eyes lit up as he lifted his legs and walked into the underworld. Behind him, Nialan sneered and burst into laughter. "Shen Tangluo, the master knows where the person you're looking for is. No need to ask your esteemed master, anyone in this ghost realm knows." Shen Tang paused in his footsteps and suddenly turned around. His sparkling peach blossom eyes instantly turned red in a big circle, fiercely locking in Nialan's figure without moving. Nialan felt a chill in her neck, and her laughter suddenly stopped. However, her voice was filled with schadenfreude, "But you're late, he's dead. He died 10 years ago." Nialan looked at the rare panic in Shen Tang's falling eyes and became even more excited. "At the end of the Soul Destruction Ghost Cave, if you go now, you will definitely still see his body. When he died, he was still thinking of you." Before Nialan could finish speaking, a black and red ghostly vine grabbed onto her neck in an instant, ending her life. 10 years ago. He died. The lonely and proud man who had to protect her for the rest of his life has died. In one sentence, like a bolt from the blue, a heavy earthquake struck Shen Tangluo's heart. The uncontrollable pain spread throughout her body in an instant, as if to take away all her breath. *0 The author has something to say. Cough. I have an unsolicited request to see if the little sisters of Wen can leave your lovely paw prints, and I would like to know your thoughts, and then make progress. The single machine is really lonely and confused. T to the power of TPS, brothers, this article has been open for free reading. Rest assured to enter the pit and watch Yun Tang and his wife sprinkle sugar. If the fairy accidentally clicks in and loses interest in it, can you add a collection, ask for a ticket and ask for a 5-star rating, daily watch, double strength, double rebirth, double cleanliness, 2-way travel, 1v1. I like love that is evenly matched, both male and female leads are very strong. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Immortal Life. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Immortal Life. Shen Tang's feet were drenched in blood, and blood flowed like a torrent, while beneath them were layers of black mist enveloping the bone nail plank bridge. This bridge stands at the end of the 10,000 Ghosts cave in the territory of the Ghost Lord. For millions of years, this place has been shrouded in wind and mist, gathering the dead bones of unjust souls in the world, forming 9,900 slender bone-eating nails, hence the bridge of life and death. Except for ghosts, all living beings in the 6 realms will break bones and burn themselves upon entry. Shen Tangluo had a cold and stern expression on his face, dragging his exhausted body, step by step stubbornly stepping on the bone-devouring nail, walking towards the end of the blazing fire in the dark purgatory. She seemed to be unable to feel the pain, and the bone nails devoured the flesh under her feet inch by inch, tearing apart the bones of her feet. Thunder and lightning flickered above the empty purgatory, wiping out the flames of the ground. Every step she took left behind deep red bloodstains, and the snowy boardwalk greedily sucked in the warm and dark red blood. Shen Tangluo's stubborn little face appeared fierce and indifferent under the reflection of the flames at the end of the bridge of life and death, while her crimson peach blossom eyes couldn't conceal nervousness and panic. A red robe bloomed like a seductive poppy, cold and beautiful. Suddenly, a ghostly purple shadow fell from the deep black and foggy bridge of life and death. He landed in front of Shen Tangluo, his dark purple eyes now tinged with crimson blood. The southern palace candle extended its skeletal hand, which was concealed under the wide robe, and pressed it onto Shen Tangluo's shoulder bones. He roared fiercely, as if trying to wake up the harmless woman in front of him. Shen Tangluo, don't leave. If you continue like this, you will lose your flesh and bones. Shen Tangluo gave him a cold glance, his black hole-like peach blossom eyes devoid of any warmth. What's wrong if there's no meat or bone left? At the end of this life and death bridge, lies the man who has lived a noble and aloof life. He's dead, and there's no one to collect the body. So, what about leaving the bones behind? Without hesitation, she raised her hand and pushed away the Nangong candle, continuing to lift her blood-stained feet with firm steps. But there were no skeletons of hands left under the purple clothes of Nangong Zhu. You're crazy, he's already dead. Nangong Zhu was very anxious and reached out to grab Shen Tangluo, intending to pick her up horizontally. But she didn't look at him, but she seemed to anticipate Nangong Zhu's movements. Her palm slashed fiercely towards his shoulder, and her foot was deeply buried in the bone nails. Pain, devouring bones and piercing the heart. However, she still did not flinch, letting the man blush in his eyes, cold and resolute. Nangong Zhu, who was hit by a palm, froze his body and stared at the stunning red shadow. His cold and dusty face turned pale, unable to conceal his sadness. He never stopped it again. Shen Tang's cold and fierce figure became increasingly transparent with each step she took. The blood light all over my body gradually dissipated into the void as I walked forward, drifting towards the pitch-black abyss beneath the bridge of life and death. Finally, at the end shrouded in black mist, on the clavicle chain, she saw the familiar and stern face. Even though she was mentally prepared, her blood couldn't help but coagulate all over her body. She had been searching for someone for 10 years, and this moment was right in front of her. However, she dared not take any further steps forward. Shen Tangluo struggled to hold back all the tears along the way, and uncontrollably burst into tears, unable to stop. Her crazy roar echoed through the purgatory-like cave, and her heart-wrenching cries seemed to pierce through the 10,000 Ghosts cave, echoing through the clouds. It's ridiculous, how ridiculous. He died for 10 years, for a whole 10 years, she was kept in the dark and couldn't find his trace. Finally, Shen Tangluo couldn't hold on and collapsed in front of the red-clothed man who was no longer breathing, confined by the chains, unable to stand up anymore. The lingering purple chains pierced through the ribs of the man in red, cutting deep into his skin and flesh. At the mouth of the man in red, there was a black hole, and his blood had dried up, leaving him lifeless. His pale face, cold and hard to the bone, handsome like the cold ice of the Tian Shan mountains, without warmth. Shen Tang's pupils tightened and he dared not look at the man in red with horror. But in the next moment, she still trembled and reached out her hands, caressing his cold and handsome face, as if afraid of hurting him. She forgot, however, that he had become a dead bone with no pain. Nangong Zhu silently followed behind her, raising her hand several times to wipe away her tears. Ko lowered his eyes to look at the hand bones that were only left with skeletons, and chuckled with self-deprecation, his face sorrowful. Shen Tangluo choked up and could hardly make a sound, her pale lips trembling uncontrollably. She put in a lot of effort to barely hoarse her voice and say, "Where's his heart?" After finishing a sentence, tears burst like a dam, sliding heavily down her pale and cold face. Nangong Zhu remained by her side, his gaze heavy, and he didn't answer her questions. Instead, he couldn't help but roar out uncontrollably, "Shen Tangluo, do you know that from the moment you stepped onto that bridge, you were destined to be completely scared?" Shen Tangluo's hoarse voice was filled with despair and the heart-wrenching vicissitudes, with crimson eyes in anger. "I only know he's cold, I want to accompany him." Shen Tangluo struggled to open her mouth, and her heart began to ache. She trembled and asked, "How did he die?" Nangong Zhu's face was solemn, and his deep tone was unusually calm. "The bone pestle gouged out the heart, and he died of exhaustion." She trembled her lips and asked, "Did you gouge out his heart?" This is the territory of the ghost lord Nangong Zhu. If a non-ghostly body enters, their strength will be limited. Nangong Zhu fell silent, his eyes filled with a deep sadness that could not be dissolved. "You destroyed his hope of reincarnation. Nangong Zhu, I hate you, forever, never to see you again." This purple spirit shackle is a magical tool only possessed by the king of the ghost realm, and belongs to the Nangong candle. Once the purple spiritual shackles are imposed, all living beings in the world will never have a path of reincarnation. Suddenly, Shen Tang's crimson eyes were tinged with hatred that destroyed the heavens and earth. Nangong Zhudong's eyes narrowed in amazement as he looked at a woman dressed in red, so beautiful that she couldn't say a word. The hands of the skeleton were tightly clenched. Tangluo said, "She hates him. Eternal life, never to see each other." Shen Tangluo, you. In front of him was a darkness, and Shen Tang suddenly felt a suffocation in his heart, only feeling that it was twisted and unable to breathe for a moment. The eyes can no longer see any light or sound, nor can they hear any sound. In the hazy consciousness, scenes of the past quickly passed through my mind. She sadly discovered that she had never been happy in her entire life. The end of despair is a bottomless abyss. The whole body was completely burned with qi and blood, and Shen Tangluo hugged the man in red and fell into a deep sleep. Nangong Zhu stood beside Shen Tangluo in panic, his dark eyes full of confusion, as if he had lost his soul, unable to lift his feet in a daze. She finally went home, but in this way. 800 years later, the ghost lord Nangong Zhu scattered his cultivation in the 10,000 ghosts cave with a skeleton body and 6 divine souls, and 2 deep red blood rays stretched for a long time. On that day, the 6 realms of 10,000 ghosts marched, fearless of the sunlight, gathering in various places with mournful voices and endless cries of sorrow. According to legend, the soul of a person who can carry a desperate love and completely cross the bridge of life and death can never be extinguished. Notice for reading. This article is entirely fictional and fictional, please do not delve into it. The first 2 chapters have a profound foreshadowing, which may be confusing now, but believe me, if you keep looking back, you will suddenly realize. Asterisk. The most important point is that Nangong Zhu doesn't have a strong presence in the previous text, but please don't stand wrong. Magic Concubine Group ID 7464698878. The group photo album contains a book on the ancient mysterious world architecture map. May the little fairies have a pleasant reading experience. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. The Dead Girl Awakens. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. The Dead Girl Awakens. Likong Continent, Xianling Palace. In a state of confusion, Shen Tangluo felt his throat and eyes dry and almost smoking. She let out a painful groan unconsciously and spewed out a mouthful of blood. The lifeless pupils gradually gathered, and a pair of iron-blooded cold eyes suddenly opened. Shen Tangluo had not yet figured out where he was currently, and his heart suddenly hurt. In the next moment, she felt as if the fleeting image of Yu Dao was about to break free from constraints and break through her mind. She vaguely remembered that after the Battle of Wujian Valley, Jun Yunsi's whereabouts were unknown. She searched for him for 10 years and guarded the Six Realms Temple for 10 years. But when I heard news about him again, I received bad news. Afterwards, she personally went to a ghost city that she had never stepped into in 100 years. Yes, isn't she already sold destroying the 10,000 ghost cave? Why does she still feel pain and thirst? As her thoughts drifted, a tender voice next to her trembled and sounded, "Sister, she's awake." In an instant, Shen Tang's lost mind was suddenly pulled back. A few childish faces were reflected in front of her, and 3 11 or 12-year-old girls surrounded her, each bowing their heads to look at the person lying on the ground, covered in tatters. Shen Tang was lost in thought. How could she stay with a group of children? She had no time to think much, her hands propped up on the ground, but she tugged at her internal organs, causing her to gasp in pain. Meanwhile, his eyes widened uncontrollably, staring at his hands in shock. These hands are clearly the hands of a child around 10 years old, young but covered in scars, with continuous cracks clinging to the entire back of the hands. Shocking. What exactly is going on here? How are you? Are you okay? The voice still spoke with the cautious and childish tone from the beginning. Shen Tangluo ignored and reluctantly endured the pain all over her body as she climbed up and looked up at the little girls with rosy faces. After 3 little girls caught a pair of cold and bloodthirsty eyes off guard, they all retreated together, their backs chilling with fear, and remained silent. Did that dead girl wake up? A piercing and sharp sound came in from outside the wooden house. When you wake up, just roll out on your own. Without seeing the person, just hearing their voice can tell that they are very angry. Following this sound came several scattered footsteps. A woman with exquisite and luxurious makeup walked towards Shen Tangluo with 2 maids. However, as soon as the woman saw this young yet stunning little face, a vicious light immediately appeared in her eyes. This face, although stained with dirt, looks very much like that woman. Especially those stunning peach blossom eyes, full of the shadow of that woman. No need to ask her name, Mrs. Nangong immediately recognized Shen Tangluo's identity. Her eyes were filled with strong disgust, and her eyes were filled with anger as she stared fixedly at the little girl surrounded by 3 little girls behind her. Madame Nangong first glanced angrily at the 3 childish little girls and scolded, "Who let you come over? You're not afraid of being covered in bad luck. Move aside." The 3 little girls were attacked and immediately obediently lowered their heads. They all said in unison, "Yes, mother." Turning around, she ordered the 2 maidservants behind her, "What are you still doing? Throw her out of the Xianling Palace for my wife. Not any stinky beggar can pretend to be the daughter of the palace master and sneak in here." This piercing and harsh voice, familiar yet distant, made Shen Tangluo suddenly start to have a splitting headache. She curled up her small body, holding her head, and distant and profound scenes flew past her mind. Mrs. Nangong kicked Shen Tangluo's bare feet and ran them over fiercely, both fierce and poisonous. "Let's do it." Shen Tang woke up immediately after falling. She remembered. This is the day 800 years ago when she was abandoned by her mother at the age of 10 and thrown into the Xianling Palace. My mother said that the master of the Xianling Palace is her biological father. She asked her to go find her father and stop causing trouble to others. My mother also said, Shen Tangluo, you, like your heartless and cold-blooded father, ruined her life. Her mother left her alone on the back mountain of the Xianling Palace, but she never appeared herself. On the day she was mercilessly abandoned in the Xianling Palace, she was unable to see her biological father. But he was beaten all over by the head of the Xianling Palace, Lady Nangong, and left to fend for himself in the back mountain. Later, when she woke up again from her coma, she saw 3 little girls practicing martial arts in the back mountain, who were her half-sister. It was precisely because she was discovered by these 3 little girls. Once again, she was caught by Lady Nangong in the wooden house behind the Xianling Palace, allowing her maid and Nangong Fei to humiliate and scold her. In the end, she was thrown into the ghost forest on the brink of death to feed the wolves. That night, she spent her time in a tug-of-war with the wolf pack. Bloody, helpless, rebellious, until exhausted. Even after 800 years, Shen Tangluo's heart couldn't help but be tinged with an imperceptible self-deprecation about this matter. How could she even remember the humiliating and painful experience she had in her childhood after death? Are you unwilling? Shen Tangluo thought he was an illusion after death. I didn't notice that the maid behind Mrs. Nangong was walking towards her after receiving the order. And all the little girls surrounding her retreated behind Nangong lady. Shen Tang's thin and small body was lifted up at once. The maid looked contemptuously at the weak girl in her hand and couldn't help but sneer, hee, a stinky beggar who dares to impersonate the daughter of the palace master. Don't even look at yourself. There is no trace of spiritual energy on the body. What is the difference between being useless and useless? That's enough to be the daughter of the palace master. Pooh, a wild seed who even dreams of entering the Xianling Palace. The 2 maids sang and reconciled, and various insults filled the entire wooden house. Shen Tangluo's collar was pulled up high, half hanging with her small body, and her ears were filled with contemptuous and humiliating ridicule. She looked around in confusion, and for a moment her ears seemed to be stuffed with a swarm of flies. It's so noisy. Shen Tang's young and tender face was now cold and deep, with a chill in her peach blossom eyes. She lifted her dirty and blood-stained little hand, impatiently concentrating her skills, but was surprised to find that her techniques could not be gathered at all. Does it mean that after death, everything from before will be taken back? No one noticed the anomaly in Shen Tang's falling eyes. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. You dare to push my mother. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. You dare to push my mother. Shen Tangluo's expression stiffened, his eyes filled with astonishment. Mrs. Nangong listened to the maid's ridicule towards Shen Tangluo and happily curled her lips. She glanced at the 3 little girls behind her and spoke arrogantly. You see clearly, they are the daughters of the palace master. Don't think you were sent by that woman, you can really fly up to the branch and become a phoenix. Madame Nangong sneered lightly, with a look of disdain on her face. Don't think anyone will come to save you. The palace master is not in the palace, and from today on, he will never know about your existence. When Lady Nangong thought of Shen Qianyan's seductive face, her hatred and ridicule mixed in her eyes. Seeing her daughter fall into her own hands, the smile on her lips kept widening. She twisted her slender waist and walked slowly towards the wooden house window, speaking proudly, if the palace master asks, do you know what to say? She turned her gaze back and swept fiercely towards the 2 maids brought in. The maids dared not question her and immediately knelt down. Madam Hui, Shen Qianyan has never been to the Xianling Palace in the future, let alone bring anyone over. She said Shen Qianyan is the biological mother of Shen Tangluo, and also the woman who left her without any news. Mrs. Nangong's exquisitely decorated face was adorned with a satisfied and sinister smile. She reached out to grab her daughter and then turned her head to look at the other two little girls. "Mother, doesn't know anything," said the slightly older girl, who was very sensible, and the other little girl just stood silently behind, not speaking. Mrs. Nangong curled her lips and smiled kindly. "Mor, my mother knows you dare not, so please keep your mouth shut. I will ensure that you have no worries about food and clothing in the Xianling Palace." The little girl trembled and whispered, "Yes, mother. Did you hear that? Today, no one knows that slut Shen Qianyan has come, nor does anyone know that a little beggar was left behind on the back mountain." Mrs. Nangong stroked her clothes and lifted her chin elegantly towards Shen Tangluo, sneering contemptuously. The same scene, if the same. Suddenly, Shen Tangluo's blood froze all over his body, his eyes turned cold, and he suddenly realized something. This scene is real, she is not an illusion, it has happened again. However, before she could react, she was slammed onto the bamboo bridge outside the wooden house. This fall had already injured her whole body, and a mouthful of eerie blood seeped out of the corners of her mouth. Her delicate lips were mixed with blood red, and her pale lips were stained with a cold and fierce color. This woman is the head of the Xianling Palace and the current wife of her biological father Nangong Kun, Yin Su. The maidservant looked at Shen Tangluo, who was bruised all over and tattered in clothes, as if looking at a clown. She raised her chin high and looked down from above, saying, "Madam, it's kind of you to save your life. You don't need to thank me, go away." Shen Tang sneered from the bottom of his heart, his plain gaze scanning the people who had walked out of the wooden house one by one, and his heart was blocked with a bitter smile. She's reborn. Why does she have no desire to live at all? What's wrong with her? Why is it so strange to return to the most destitute time in the past? Yin Su saw the little girl lying motionless on the ground, like a lifeless corpse, and suddenly lost her breath. She suddenly walked up to Shen Tangluo with a look like a venomous snake in her eyes, so fierce that she mercilessly stepped on Shen Tangluo's blood-stained little hand. The intense pain on the back of her hand made Shen Tangluo's cold eyes darken. She quickly lifted her other hand and grabbed Yin Su's ankle, exerting force to the side. She has no desire to live, but being able to live again and return to the beginning is not something to be bullied or trampled upon. Who is she? She is Shen Tangluo, the fearless female demon head of the 6 realms. She lived for 800 years in her past life and was hated by the ghost shadow killing god in the ghost realm. She is no longer the 10-year-old girl who can be bullied by anyone, not a pitiful creature abandoned by her parents. With a loud bang, Yin Su's heavy body collided with the bamboo and wood bridge, and the protruding bamboo thorns happened to pass through the tender skin on her side face. Shen Tang's peach blossom eyes flicked, and a faint cold light burst out. With all his strength, he pushed Yin Su, who was stepping on the back of her hand, into the lake, instantly triggering a huge splash of water. Yin Su didn't have time to cry out in pain before falling into the cold water. "Hurry up, help madam." The maid was confused for a moment and immediately became very anxious, shouting anxiously. However, there were no other people near the wooden house except for a few little girls and maids. Yin Su was already afraid of a scandal that would harm her reputation. Before coming to the wooden house on the back mountain, she only brought 2 maids over. Everyone else was sent far away from the wooden house by her. For a moment, everyone was confused and in chaos, unable to believe that a 10-year-old girl could be so fierce. Yin Su is the legitimate daughter of the elder of the Xianling Palace. She has been pampered since childhood and is not accustomed to water habits. She also forgets that she has cultivation, and immediately jumps like a wild chicken after falling into the water. Go. Go out and find someone to save madam. The maid who was pushed around responded in confusion and quickly ran away. You dare to push my mother. A little girl with a similar appearance to Yin Su finally realized what had happened and shouted angrily. This little girl is Yin Su's only daughter, the legitimate daughter of Xianling Palace, Nangong Fei. In the previous life, Shen Tang fell on the desolate back mountain of the Xianling Palace and was subjected to humiliation, beating, and scolding by the mother and daughter, tormenting him to the point of almost losing his life. At that time, she was covered in bruises and bruises, completely unconscious as she woke up from the darkness, struggling to escape. If it weren't for Nangong Mo sneaking up the mountain at night and bringing her water and food. I'm afraid she died of thirst before encountering a pack of wolves. People can skip meals, but they must not lack water. However, Nangong Mo dared not offend Madam. After delivering these, he only left a message, "Take care," and ran back. Later on, how did she survive? Thinking about this, Shen Tangluo suddenly froze. The beautiful peach blossom eyes became sour, tears hazy, blurring the line of sight. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Chopping my lady's hand and feeding the wolf. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Chopping my lady's hand and feeding the wolf. She met a young man, whose starry eyes still sparkle in her mind to this day. It was the boy who saved her life and healed her injuries. However, the man who lit up the light of her life is now sleeping in the ghost cave and will never appear here again. He can no longer accompany her. Shen Tangluo exerted all his strength and pushed Yin Su into the water, but suddenly realized the danger. Although she knew she was not out of trouble at the moment, she still couldn't bear it. This body is too weak and weak. Shen Tangluo was limp all over, his mind was groggy, and he collapsed without warning. Nangong Fei and Nangong Yi, who wanted to go forward and teach Shen Tangluo a lesson, were both shocked before they even touched Shen Tangluo's body. What's going on? They were so scared they didn't dare to approach earlier, and now they're falling to the ground with a loud bang, confusing the two little girls. Standing aside, Nangong Mo concealed the complexity in his eyes and carefully walked over to check Shen Tangluo's breath. He looked up and said to his two sisters, "She fainted." Nangong Fei released her second sister Nangong Yi's hand and walked over to see, pretend to be dead. At this moment, Yin Su was brought up, and her sharp voice coughed for a while because she had poured a lot of water. When she finally made a sound, she hoarsely shouted, "Go, chop off the hands of this dead girl for my wife, and throw them together into the forest behind the mountain. Feed the wolf." After speaking, she coughed violently, her face turned red, and she shivered. Yin Su lost such a big face in front of her daughter and servants, and her emotions were terrible. She was angry and said, "Do as Madam said, do it clean. You three, don't look, go back and practice well." Her daughter has average talent and aptitude, otherwise she wouldn't have been so embarrassed just now when she fell into the water. After speaking, Yin Su stubbornly kicked Shen Tangluo and was then carried away by a maid. Two guards were left behind to deal with Shen Tangluo. Nangong Mo turned her head 3 times in one step, taking a deep look at the unfortunate little girl. Her deep eyes were filled with a hint of powerless sorrow. She thought that the unconscious little girl must have no idea what her fate would be against her mother. It's good if she's just unconscious, she doesn't know anything when she's unconscious. In the ghostly forest behind the mountain, hungry wolves with venomous fangs will devour her alive, leaving no bones or debris. Everyone has left, everything has returned to calm, and the scene just now seems to have never happened. The two guards looked at each other, and one of them reached out and easily lifted the skinny Shen Tangluo. "By the way, how did this little girl offend Madam?" The guard who mentioned Shen Tangluo pinched her sharp chin and asked her companion with a smile. My companion beside me pondered for a moment and said, "It seems that I have offended Mississippi. Madam is the kind-hearted and treats people well. Have you ever seen Madam punish servants?" After careful consideration, the guard holding Shen Tangluo shook his head and said, "That's not true. Miss is the enemy of the palace master and his wife. The wife dotes on Miss the most. If this little girl is beaten like this, she must have offended Mississippi." The guard pushed his companion and chuckled jokingly, "So how did Our Lady fall into the water?" It's impossible that this little girl who hasn't even weighed 2 pounds of meat pushed her down, right? Anyway, what do you want to do so much? Just follow Madam's orders. The guard put down the hand that pinched Shen Tang's chin, and his words somehow became more and more biased, turning into vulgar language. To be honest, this little girl looks really good. After washing her clean, she may look better than our young lady. Unfortunately, she's just too young. Otherwise, you and I could. Disgusting and obscene words dispersed in the mountain wind, and the 2 guards laughed heartily as they echoed in the air. Shen Tangluo fell completely asleep, completely unaware of what fate he was about to face. Behind the Xianling Palace, on the outskirts of the Ghost Shadow Forest, the 2 guards instinctively shrunk their necks, and the cold and gloomy wind blew their hair in their hearts. The guard holding Shen Tangluo couldn't help but spat and shrunk his neck. Damn it, why is this back mountain so cold? It's like a ghost is living there. Just leave it on the periphery. Madam said to clean it up and don't cause any trouble. On the outskirts of the Ghost Shadow Forest, although there are no monsters, there are also countless fierce tigers, jackals, and wolves. If you lie unconscious inside, there will definitely be no bones left. The 2 guards are not at all worried about accidents and cannot complete the task given by Nangong Madam. The guard cursed profusely and threw the thin and weak body of the little girl far away. Immediately after, they heard a crashing sound, looked at each other with a smile, and quickly left. At night, the cold and gloomy wind blew away the fine fallen leaves covering Shen Tangluo's body. With bare arms and feet, waves of cold wind hit Shen Tangluo's body, and the sound of fierce beasts hissing in his ears. Suddenly, Shen Tangluo opened a pair of cold and fierce peach blossom eyes, and cautiously retreated to the tree, leaning against it and not daring to move easily. Wolf pack, nearby. She casually lowered her eyes and saw her bare feet, then sneered and tugged at her lips. She eventually overestimated her body and fainted due to exhaustion. In her past life, she indulged in the grief of her mother abandoning her and never rebelled against Lady Nangong, so she was thrown into the back mountain soberly. And this time, I couldn't escape the fate of being thrown into the ghost forest. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Nangong Mo. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Nangong Mo. A rustling sound came from my ears, and the distant wolf howls echoed through the deep darkness of the night. Shen Tang's seductive peach blossom eyes lifted upwards, with a light smile at the corner of her mouth and a deeper curve. At this time in his past life, Nangong Mo came over. It seems that when reborn, some things may change, but some things will never change. This little girl, although she was clearly afraid, was still afraid and wanted to help her. Shen Tang's eyelids drooped as she leaned wearily against the ancient tree, looking down at her hands. She couldn't sit idly by. She has been to this ghost forest several times, and the unknown danger inside is not something that she, who cannot cultivate and even struggles to stand up, can stay for a long time. She used to be constantly scolded for being a ghost, not just out of thin air. It is said that when her mother was pregnant for 6 months, she really died in her womb, but later came back to life for some unknown reason. In the body of a baby, she died once, so she was born weak and unable to cultivate, and was scolded as useless by the Nangong family, which is also one of the reasons. What kind of secret is hidden in this matter, only the mother who is pregnant with her knows. In her past life, she had never seen the woman who disappeared after leaving her, and had no way of knowing what had happened that year. Later, she discovered another cultivation method in the Ghost Shadow Forest that was different from the 8 major systems in the ancient mystical world, and thus embarked on the path of ghost cultivation, opening up ghost-based techniques. Originally, Shen Tangluo wanted to directly enter the depths of the ghost forest. But when his gaze touched upon his tattered clothes and bare feet, Shen Tang lowered his eyebrows and smiled. She's not so foolish, she has to walk barefoot. There are many dead branches in the Ghost Shadow Forest, and before she reaches the place she wants to go, this delicate flesh will be torn by the withered branches on the ground. If the smell of blood attracts beasts, she will inevitably engage in a bloody battle. Moreover, at this moment, her throat was dry and painful, her physical strength was exhausted, and she couldn't tolerate her stubbornness. Shen Tang's pitch-black peach blossom eyes were like a pool of bottomless water, staring at the ground without blinking. Somehow, his eyes began to ache. She remembered her past life, where she had stayed in the Six Realms Temple for so long. I have heard of resurrection and soul-snatching, but I have never heard of being able to start over after death. She, who had lost all her soul, woke up, so what about him? Will it still be like when they first met here in their previous lives? Although he was very certain that Jun Yunsi would never have reincarnation, Shen Tangluo still looked eagerly into the depths of the ghost shadow forest. Uncontrollably, he is still there. Suddenly, a small sound of footsteps gradually approached, and Shen Tangluo tightened his nerves and had to be cautious. Even with memories of her past life, she dare not relax at all. Without any cultivation, Shen Tangluo had an exceptionally strong ability to see things at night and recognize the small figure approaching her at a glance. It was indeed Nangong Mo, she did not disappoint herself. Shen Tangluo pretended to cough lightly, and Nangong Mo immediately rushed towards the sound source. Nangong Mo's biological mother came from a humble background and was not favored. Under the influence of her biological mother, she was born to consciously restrain her sharpness and was even less willing to curry favor with her legitimate daughter like Nangong Yi. In fact, what puzzled Shen Tang was that as long as Nangong Mo was willing, it was easy to win the attention of his biological father Nangong Kun. But she was afraid of stealing the spotlight from Nangong Fei, knowing that her talent was countless times higher than Nangong Fei's, so she was still careful to hide herself. Here you are. Nangong Mofei swept over to Shen Tangluo's side, crouched down, and stuffed a medium-sized bundle into her arms. Shen Tang raised his eyebrows and frowned as he carefully scrutinized Nangong Mo. In her past life, she took the package and said thank you, but Nangong Mo replied with a word of care and left. From then on, they had no intersection. Because when she returned to the Xianling Palace, she wanted to thank Nangong Mo seriously, but was told a regrettable news that made her feel regretful. Nangong Mo contracted a malignant disease and died of it. However, upon closer examination, it is impossible at all. Nangong Mo's physique and cultivation ability are the highest among the Xianling Palace generation. How could she possibly die of illness? Undoubtedly, it was silenced. Shen Tangluo suddenly didn't know how to speak. She, who was naturally not good at words, couldn't help but remind Nangong Mo, you actually don't have to be afraid of Nangong Madam. Nangong Mo's movements froze as he stood up, pretending not to hear. Just as I was about to leave, I turned around and said, take care of the medicine, clothes, and food. I can't stay any longer. Let's go first, take care. Nangong Mo hurriedly left, and as for whether she understood her words or not, Shen Tangluo didn't think much. She quickly took out the ointment from her bag and gently applied it for a while, but her hand movements suddenly stopped. Have many things changed in this life? Shen Tangluo couldn't think much and quickly picked up the bundle on the ground. He climbed up the towering ancient tree with ease, and a cold light flashed in his enchanting peach blossom eyes. She keenly sensed the danger approaching quietly. What exactly happened in the ghost forest? The beasts on all sides seemed to be afraid of a stronger force than them, quickly disappearing without a trace, while another strong breath swept through from the inside out. Shen Tang lowered his black eyes and looked coldly into the depths of the ghost shadow forest. He made a quick decision and put on the clothes, shoes, and socks that Nangong Mo had put in his bag. Suddenly, he jumped off the tree branch and ran towards the outside of the ghost shadow forest. When should we wait instead of running at this moment? The ferocious beasts have all retreated, and she is not barefoot either. It is definitely a great time to leave. You can come back to Ghost Forest in the future, but your life cannot be compromised. It is obvious that there is a monster riot inside. Shen Tang fell on the soles of his feet and the wind blew, and his short legs ran very fast. However, at this moment, a sudden accident occurred. Shen Tangluo's petite ears twitched slightly, and her keen perception made her instinctively roll to the side, without realizing that her clothes were also torn apart by the dead branches. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Is him, Jun Yunsi. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 is him, Jun Yunsi. A strange and astonishing force struck from the depths of the ghost forest. In an instant, Shen Tangluo's thin and frail figure was like a thin leaf being impacted deeper into the pitch black. The accident happened so quickly that there was no room for contemplation. Shen Tangluo struggled to open his heavy eyes with all his might, but he couldn't even see what caused such a strong fluctuation. His petite body was instantly shaken far away. She rolled down on the ground, her left dress completely scratched and torn by the ground and dead branches, and the pain that followed made her feel a bit confused. In an instant, my stomach churned and my mind was dizzy, wishing to completely faint. There seemed to be a thick and warm liquid rushing out of her throat, and the pungent and sweet smell diffused in her mouth, making her almost gasp for breath. Shen Tang's eyebrows and eyes furrowed with coldness, and the chilly night breeze stirred up layers of withered leaves beside her. She is most familiar with this power. Someone touched the millennium-old withered vine in the ghost forest, and that power is the spiritual power that erupts when withered vine encounters danger. The millennium withered vine is a medicinal spirit that can reshape the meridians and physique of cultivators. Shen Tangluo's innate spiritual element is incomplete, and he cannot cultivate any of the 8 major systems of the Sky Continent. I am not at all interested in the practice of hunting medicinal spirits or monster beasts to improve my cultivation. What she cares about is that she is so weak that she has been devastated by the medicine spirit's violent body. This clean and warm dress was just delivered by Nangong Mo not long ago. Is it just destroyed like this? Shen Tangluo couldn't help but cry and laugh, unsure of how to describe her current mood. She took a deep breath, ignoring the heaviness in her heart as she lifted her breath, and barely stood up with her right hand propped up. Suddenly, Shen Tangluo's body, which had not yet stabilized, was engulfed by a dark green phantom. In the blink of an eye, her thin and weak body was dragged into the air by this phantom, rising tens of meters high. Shen Tangluo's whole body seemed to be on fire, with a sharp and painful sensation. His thin little hands couldn't help but feel the faint shadow, and his already sickly and cold white face added a touch of paleness. I don't know how many times I was forced to drag around in the void, perhaps this 1,000-year-old withered vine has been tamed. The force surrounding her slowly dissipated from Shen Tang's waist, while her soaring body plummeted straight to the ground. Shen Tangluo's face condensed, and a hint of evil flashed in his clear and dark peach blossom eyes. So high, falling down, without cultivation to protect oneself, unable to make meat patties, isn't it a pity for this height? Just as he was pulled into the air, Shen Tangluo tensed his nerves and calmly looked around at all the supporting objects to prevent the constraints from dissipating. However, just as her body was imbalanced and falling, she suddenly fell into a warm and generous embrace. Shen Tang was startled, his pupils and eyes suddenly tightened, his heart pounding uncontrollably and trembling violently, and his breathing stopped. The fleeting thoughts in my mind gradually became clearer as I breathed in the breath. Is it him? She stiffened her neck, looked up, and looked up. Just such a simple action seemed to exhaust all her life's strength. In an instant, stunning red shadows and a cold and proud expression. In a short moment, Shen Tang's throat fell as if it was stuck by a huge stone, choking up in silence. There seemed to be something uncontrollably rolling down in the pantothenic eyes. She maintained a posture of looking up, her stunned expression as if crossing time to rest on the cold and profound face of the man holding her. The man's eyebrows and eyes were sparse and cold, his nose was high and straight, his thin lips were indifferent, and his cold and hard facial features were unparalleled in beauty, yet he could not conceal his noble and domineering aura. He is. Shen Tang's heart tightened uncontrollably, grabbing the man's robe tightly, his whole heart trembling. Jun Yunsi didn't know what kind of turbulent waves were in the heart of the person in his arms. He frowned slightly, lightly tapped his foot, and placed Shen Tang's delicate body on the ground. Without looking back, he turned around and left. The red clothes were as enchanting as bloodstains, and his cold and pale eyebrows and eyes were sharp and solemn. His expression was icy and piercing, and there was no hint of warmth in his naturally thin and cool phoenix eyes. Demon red and bloodstained, like a wild demon, shocking the heavens and humans. His face is clearly Jun Yunsi. She is very certain that he is the man she has been looking for a whole 10 years. It's him, Jun Yunsi. It was the lonely and proud man who had already been engraved in her bones and blood before she knew it. Watching the red shadow disappear, Shen Tangluo's expression instantly became flustered and uneasy, her heart suddenly twisted and she couldn't open her mouth. Her throat was so dry and hoarse that she couldn't even make a sound. Yunsi. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Yunsi, you are responsible to me. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Yunsi, you are responsible to me. How could he just leave like this? Just walked away so mercilessly. Shen Tang was lost in thought. And the heart, which had come back to life from seeing Jun Yunsi again, suddenly froze, and the panic overwhelmed the excitement. Shen Tang's restlessness was hard to conceal, and the light in Peach Blossom's eyes dimmed, forgetting that he should have caught that red figure at this moment. She shouldn't stand stiff here, she should go and keep him. What's wrong with her? Suddenly, Shen Tangluo's hoarse voice shouted at the tall young man in a tone that was both urgent and fierce, afraid that he wouldn't be able to keep him. Jun Yunsi, you can't leave, you stop. Jun Yunsi was startled by the towering figure of Hong's back, but did not turn around. In the pitch black, a pair of deep phoenix eyes flickered with confusion. How could this little girl know her name? He gently tugged at the corner of his mouth, laughing and mocking, but still didn't turn his head. Shen Tang didn't care so much about it. From the moment Jun Yun stopped walking, she became even more certain. She lowered her eyes with a bitter smile and glanced at her tattered dress, then sniffed. In her past life, if she had worn less, he would have frowned and forced her to add clothes with a displeased expression. But now, he is still alive and appears in front of her, but remains indifferent to her, who is not fully clothed. Jun Yunsi's figure disappeared into the darkness, and she was almost unable to keep him. Shen Tangluo suddenly realized that in this life, Jun Yunsi still doesn't recognize her. With this in mind, Shen Tangluo picked out the reddish peach blossom eye tail and chased towards the direction where Jun Yunsi had left. She was afraid that Jun Yunsi wouldn't hear her, so her voice was raised several times and she shouted, Jun Yunsi, I know it's you. Stop it for me. In the darkness, Jun Yunsi's figure, who had not yet walked far, shook and a strange feeling inexplicably swept over his left chest. He lifted his well-defined palm and instinctively caressed his heart, where it seemed to be telling him to turn back. Just like, once he leaves, he will surely regret for life. Jun Yunsi was frowning and thinking, but his body involuntarily turned towards the little girl who was panting and running towards him. The little girl's body was as thin as wood, and her height was not even close to her waist. The blood-stained little face was lifted slightly, gasping for breath. On the dirty, messy face, the clear and spring-like eyes were tinged with a thin mist, and the eyes were bright and burning. It can be seen that at a young age, she has faintly bloomed with a stunning appearance. Jun Yunsi lowered his gaze and scrutinized her small face, seeing emotions that he couldn't understand in her eyes. She's anxious, is she afraid of the dark? Are you still afraid that he might leave? Jun Yun furrowed his brows, his thin and cold lips slightly parted, and said coldly, do you recognize me? Shen Tang was heavily injured time and time again, and her delicate little face was covered with a trace of blood. However, she was accustomed to the pain and didn't know that her face was injured. She smiled and her eyes seemed to be filled with stars for an instant. Inexplicably, upon seeing this smile, a ripple appeared in Jun Yunsi's indifferent phoenix eyes. At this moment, the thin and petite figure unexpectedly rushed into Jun Yunsi's arms without warning. The familiar embrace and familiar breath made the brilliance in Shen Tang's peach blossom eyes even brighter. She reached out her tender little hand and in the next moment, she opened the collar of Jun Yunsi's chest. Jun Yunsi's cold face froze, and his body was tense and motionless. And those little hands, as if confirming something, repeatedly touched his left chest. Jun Yunsi's cold and stern eyebrows and eyes were tinged with shock, and his expression on the face was unpredictable. He didn't refuse. But soon, with a disdainful expression, he pulled out the little girl who was caressing in his arms. You. He was about to teach her a lesson, but as soon as he spoke, he lost his voice. Because as soon as he lowered his eyes, he met a small face with teary eyes. Shen Tangluo should have laughed, but unfortunately, her tears were uncontrollable. Her eyes seemed to be immersed in a river, and the more she flowed, the more fierce she became. It was like being bullied and miserable. She was afraid that he wouldn't recognize her and treat her as a stranger, and then coldly left her. She felt anxious and said without hesitation, Jun Yunsi, you have to take responsibility for me. Shen Tangluo tilted her neck back in an uncomfortable position, but she didn't care at all. She spoke seriously. Jun Yun's eyes flickered with an imperceptible hint of amazement. His deep rhinoceros eyes narrowed slightly and he said coldly, what did you say? This voice was deep and cold, even with a bone-chilling threat, but Shen Tangluo was not afraid at all. Instead, she boldly extended her small hand stained with mud, grabbed Jun Yunsi's immaculate sleeve, raised her eyes, and spoke very clearly, you've seen through my body, you have to take responsibility. The cool night breeze blew in, tugging at their ink hair and opening up the words spoken by Shen Tangluo. Every word fell into Jun Yunsi's ear. In the darkness, Jun Yunsi's facial expression was completely concealed. Shen Tangluo shrank her neck from the cold, and her exposed skin instinctively trembled. Seeing that Jun Yunsi remained indifferent, Shen Tang lowered his small hand and tugged hard at his sleeve, ignoring his red ear tips. He was extremely regretful and said, Jun Yunsi, you're not responsible. I'll rely on you for my whole life. A moment ago, I was secretly annoyed that the dress sent by Nangong Mo was scratched and torn. At this moment, Shen Tangluo felt very embarrassed and thought that the torn clothes could no longer be worth it. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. I'm joking. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. I'm joking. She is somewhat grateful for the medicinal spirit of the millennium withered vine. When its essence is destroyed, it can also give itself a chance to reunite with Jun Yunsi. At night, it is quiet and serene. Four eyes face each other, one hot as fire, and the other cold as frost. Shen Tangluo's hand slowly tightened, his peach blossom eyes adorned with stars slowly curled up, his long eyelashes as thin as butterfly wings blinked lightly, and his hot and burning heart also jumped up and down. She was waiting for Jun Yunsi's response, but she couldn't be sure if the man who didn't know her at the time would allow her to play tricks. But she can't control so much anymore, she just wants to hold on to him. Shen Tangluo has never been good at expressing himself, how proactive a person is. It's the first time I've said such a blushing and heartbreaking thing in front of a man. Especially, the person she is facing is still Jun Yunsi. No matter how bold and reckless she is, she can't help but feel nervous. Who knows how much confidence she put in and how much face she gave up before saying such a sentence. She always knew that Jun Yunsi had always been indifferent, aloof, and resistant to people from afar. But upon returning from her rebirth, this time she was not as wary of him as in her previous life. But he took the initiative to approach, he should have some reaction, right? Jun Yunsi's handsome and cold face froze, and he even forgot to tidy up the clothes that were pulled open by Tangluo. What does this little girl say? He saw through her body. If he's not responsible, he'll have to cling to him for a lifetime. For a lifetime. Jun Yunsi's pupils darkened as he looked at Tangluo, feeling a mixture of inexplicable complexity in his heart. This seemingly weak little girl is a bit too wild and bold. Did you really take his recent move to save her seriously and want to make a commitment to him? He came to retrieve the essence of a 1,000-year-old withered vine and accidentally caught a glimpse of her petite figure falling down. He didn't even understand why he instinctively tried to catch her. Jun Yun's cold phoenix eyes were tinged with a hint of annoyance, but he didn't realize it. His face was as heavy as water, and he took all the expectations in Tang's eyes as if he hadn't seen them. He said in a low voice, "It's a small gesture to save you, there's no need to take it seriously." His expression was so cold, so serious, and his breath was as cold as a cold night, causing Tangluo's heart to sink to the bottom. He really doesn't remember himself at all, he doesn't want to have any interaction with her at all. Even though she knew he didn't mean it, a delicate prickling pain still appeared in her chest. In her past life, her encounter with Jun Yunsi was not like this. At that time, she did not appear here, but saw him in the midst of being torn apart by the wolf pack on the periphery. She struggled with a group of fierce wolves who were eyeing her for 2 whole hours, and suddenly the boy in red appeared and picked her up, covered in injuries. That group of ferocious wolves were also killed on the spot by Jun Yunsi. In his past life, Jun Yunsi had a solitary and cold personality, but he cared for her everywhere and showed all kinds of tenderness. Tang tightened her small hand and looked up at Jun Yunsi's indifferent black eyes. She chuckled lightly, concealing her disappointment in her eyes. She struggled to open her mouth and said, "I'm joking." Jun Yun was extremely surprised and inexplicably felt the strange look of the little girl in front of him, as if he saw the fleeting pain and depression in her originally burning eyes. Just like, this sentence was not her intention. Somehow, Jun Yunsi felt that this scene was very familiar, and a scene flashed through his mind so quickly that he couldn't even grasp it. It seems that at some point, he had also seen a figure, living in a bustling world, yet lonely and desolate. He instinctively wanted to say something, but he had never comforted anyone before. His throat rolled and he didn't say a word in the end. His black eyes were heavy, and his drooping gaze touched his messy robe that had been picked up by those small hands. I suddenly realized that this little girl should also be responsible for herself. Jun Yunsi's lips stiffened slightly, and his face darkened. He remembered the little girl's wild and sycophantic tone, as well as the skilled and rough movements of directly picking at the man's clothes. Jun Yunsi bent down slightly and his voice couldn't help but soften. He asked in a low voice, "Who are you? Tell me, why are you here?" He had already noticed that the little girl in front of him had no spiritual energy on her body, and her natural energy was incomplete. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Remember, my name is Tangluo. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Remember, my name is Tangluo. This is not the place where a little girl should appear in the middle of the night. Jun Yun leaned forward, his slender and beautiful fingertips touching Tangluo's eyebrows, and strands of warm and gentle spiritual power seeped into her whole body. Tang's drooping peach blossom eyes suddenly lit up, and he looked up in shock, facing his 4 eyes. She was well aware that Jun Yunsi was healing for herself. Jun Yunsi was born to be one of those amazing beings, possessing the most outstanding talent for refining medicine in the ancient mystical world. Her injury, in his eyes, could hardly be called an injury. Tang moved her lips and stared at the man's cold face, smiling brilliantly and good-looking. The feeling of melancholy in her heart also dissipated. With every frown and smile, the pear vortex is refreshing and seductive. Her clean and clear eyes were particularly eye-catching, with a clear and sweet voice of glutinous rice. However, with a hint of lightness and romance, she opened her mouth and said, I'm looking for you. Jun Yunsi had deep black eyes, staring at her bright and peach blossom-like little face without saying a word, clearly not believing. A deep gaze fell on her delicate skin stained with blood, and her eyebrows furrowed fiercely. He didn't know what was wrong with himself. When he saw the broken dress on the little girl's body, he pursed his thin lips and even raised his hand to wipe away the blood from her face. Jun Yunsi saw that her expression had softened a lot, and then he restrained his spiritual power. His magnetic and hoarse voice carried a different kind of magic. At a young age, it's quite frivolous. Immediately, he took off his outer robe and directly covered Shen Tangluo's head. His breath was cold, and the broad robe mixed with a faint medicinal fragrance instantly rushed into Shen Tangluo's breath, familiar yet long lost. Shen Tangluo's face stiffened with a sweet smile. She was both confused and confused. What does Jun Yunsi mean by this? Is it because I despised myself for dirtying his clothes? How could he do this? Shen Tangluo angrily grabbed the robe that was blocking her view, and with a cold voice, she blushed and said, Jun Yunsi, I just accidentally got dirty. Do you need to be so stingy? In his past life, no matter how indifferent and inhumane he was, he would not have despised himself so blatantly. Put it on. Jun Yunsi didn't explain, and a hint of complexity flashed in his eyebrows and eyes. Shen Tangluo grabbed the hand of his wide coat robe and understood his meaning in an instant. He murmured to himself, it turns out he's caring about himself. After a while, Shen Tang's delicate little face bloomed with a bright and brilliant smile. In an instant, the sky was filled with stars and the clear moon seemed to be half as charming as her. A hint of amazement flashed in Jun Yunsi's eyes, and in that moment, he was stunned, feeling that he had not seen her for the first time. Jun Yunsi calmly suppressed his shock and asked Shen Tangluo indifferently, who are you and why do you know my name? Shen Tangluo was about to say her name, but she paused for a moment before jokingly changing her tone. I am the wife who will walk hand in hand with you for a lifetime. If you want Jun Yunsi to be willing to entangle with her more, you must first make him doubt his actions, so that she can have the opportunity to approach him step by step. In the quiet deep forest, rustling withered leaves drifted, and their clothes fluttered and their ink hair spread out. Jun Yunsi's whole body trembled greatly, and Shen Tangluo didn't notice that his other hand suddenly clenched tightly, and a rough sea appeared in his eyes. Wife. Jun Yun squinted her phoenix eyes, not realizing that she was talking nonsense this time. Shen Tang lowered the corners of his mouth and hooked his evil expression, his eyes filled with solemnity. He smiled beautifully and his voice softened as he said, this time, I'm serious, not joking. In this situation, speaking such words from her mouth doesn't seem frivolous. The 10-year-old girl has a childlike innocence on her face. Before he could finish speaking, Jun Yun grabbed Shen Tangluo's slender wrist bone without adding any gravity and asked, who the hell are you? He saw in the eyes of this little girl the arrogance and determination that were not her age. Shen Tangluo lowered her eyes and watched as he tightly grasped her big hand. She looked up at him with deep and cold eyes, which were affectionate. With a childlike voice, she said, Yunsi, it's okay if you didn't know me before, but now remember, my name is Shen Tangluo. I was the person you saved tonight, and I will always be by your side in the future. After finishing speaking, she wrapped up Jun Yunsi's robe tightly and stared at his hand tightly gripping her wrist, unable to help but curl the corners of her mouth. End of this chapter.